So I'm going to give a presentation about creating a test kit for a implementation guide. And we're going to do this based on US Core 311 for a couple of reasons. One is that US Core is a really common implementation guide that a lot of people are familiar with. And also we have a server set up with resources for US Core 311, so it's easy to show these tests running against an actual server. So I'll start off giving an overview of the repositories, or the important ones for Inferno that you'll want to be familiar with if you're writing tests. And the main one is this Inferno Template repository. It's in the Inferno Framework GitHub organization, where there are a number of Inferno related repositories. But if you want to write tests, Inferno Template is always where you start. So the other repositories of note in here, there's Inferno Core, and this is the repository with the code for like Inferno itself, which defines the domain-specific language, or DSL, for writing tests, and includes the code for running those tests. Oh, this is Inferno Core. Yep. So this is like for the main Inferno library, which you will use in creating a test kit. I'll say the one big Inferno repo that you may be familiar with that is not in the Inferno Framework organization is the one for the ONC certification G10 test kit, which lives in the ONC Health IT organization. So this is an example of a pretty complicated set of tests that do a lot. And if we look through the other repositories in Inferno Framework, you'll see some other test kits. Here's one for the Saner implementation guide. Here's one that we use for generating US Core sample data. Here's our like real US Core test kit that is much more complicated than like what we'll be doing today for this introduction. All right, so here's the Inferno template, and you look through it and there's all this stuff in here. So you don't need to know what most of that stuff is. I'll go over sort of the layout and organization of this repository in a minute. So if you come down into the README, here are instructions for how to use it. Then there are links to documentation. So if you want to write tests, the first thing you should check out is this Inferno documentation, which will bring you here to our hosted documentation on github.io. And so there are some general things on the side, as well as some more detailed information about writing tests. We'll be looking through some of this while I go through this demo. And then the other place that will be helpful is the Ruby API documentation. So this is more like real developer-oriented documentation, like going through the classes and the modules in Inferno Core itself and showing the methods. So when you need more details about how something works, this is sort of the next step after this documentation. And sometimes this documentation will lead you here rather than document every available method. So in here, the main place that you will look for information is like here in this DSL module. And so for instance, assertions, these are various built-in assertions that you can use in your tests. FHIR client, if you want to know about like what sort of how to make FHIR requests, that's in here. HTTP client, right? You can see how to make HTTP requests. So, right, this is a next step if you need more details about particular functionality. All right, so let's just get a quick overview of what is in this template repository. And here, back in the documentation, there's this section on test kit repository layout and organization. So this isn't every file that's in there, but these are sort of the main ones, right? The Docker file, right? We use Docker for running Inferno so that you don't have to set up a Ruby environment locally in order to use it. If you are able to set up Ruby locally, that's great. And there are some that can make your development process easier. But it's mainly, based around, using Docker to build images. And then we use Docker Compose to run Inferno itself. There are several services that are actually needed in order to run Inferno. But the Docker file, there's like very limited things that you might need to change in there, or in the Docker Compose, you won't have to do much there. Config contains configuration for things like your database or your web server, because Inferno is a web-based application. And again, unless you're trying to do something different, you probably won't have to mess with that. Data is where like the actual data in your database lives. So you probably won't need to change that. But if you want to like delete your database or copy it somewhere, like that's where it lives. I'll skip over the gem spec for now. And in lib, this is where your actual tests get written. So Inferno core is set up so that like when you, and the template, they're set up so that when you use this template to create a test kit, you can easily publish it as a Ruby gem. The gem is just the word that they use to call like a Ruby library. So you can distribute your test kit so that other people can use it using like the base like Ruby language library functionality. So along with that, this gem spec defines what sort of like dependencies you have. Like, do you need other Ruby libraries? And if you're writing like some Inferno tests, at the very least, you're going to need Inferno core, right? Because that defines like how you write stuff in Inferno. And then inside lib, you'll write your tests. And then IGs is a place to put your IG package for validation. Inside spec, you can put unit tests if you want to write tests for your tests, which if you're doing complicated testing things, you may want to. All right, so that's the basic layout. So let's actually get something running. So the first step is to clone this repository. You can do that like up here. Well, actually, like the way to do it is to hit this use this template button, since this is a template repository. And then there's just like a UI way to do it in GitHub, which I'm not really going to do because I don't want to like actually make a repo on GitHub. I'm just going to do it locally. So I'll go ahead and clone this down, move into that directory. So we'll write our tests in lib. Okay, we'll do that later. And put the package for the IG we're writing in lib something /IGs. We will also do that later. I just want to get things like working and running first. Run setup.sh to set up the Docker images and the database. So run setup, and you'll see there's pulling the Docker images, building a Docker image, and then there'll be a bunch of stuff scrolling by to set up the database, which is that. All right, so that's done. And now we can run.sh to build the tests and run Inferno. If anyone has questions while I'm going through this, feel free to raise your hand or put something in chat. I am not averse to being interrupted. All right, so it is running. So now it says we can navigate to localhost to access Inferno and navigate to localhost/validator to access a FHIR validator. So let's just go to localhost. Okay, Inferno Test Suite template, right? We're in the template repo, so that's what we have. We have capability statement tests and some patient tests. Let's try localhost validator. So here we have a FHIR validator, and let's go ahead and try to validate a resource. We're going to be validating against, or we're going to be working with US Core 311. So let's just try to validate a US Core 311 resource. So here, if we go to the US Core 311 implementation guide, we can go to examples, and let's just get a patient example. And I'll copy this JSON, paste it in the validator. And no errors found, but here we see we have a warning. The profile reference to US Core patient has not been checked because it is unknown, and the validator is set to not fetch unknown profiles. Okay, so we haven't actually loaded the US Core implementation guide into the validator. So it just validated it against the base patient FHIR resource definition. But we want to be able to validate things against US Core 311. So let's go ahead and get that IG loaded. So back here in the template, right in the instructions, it says to put the package.tgz for the IG you're writing tests for in lib/your test kit name/IGs. And we haven't changed anything in the template. So if we look in lib, it'll be lib Inferno Template, and then there's IGs. So if we go back to the US Core implementation guide, we can go to downloads, and we can download the package, right? Package file. So that's downloaded. I will stop Inferno. I'll copy that package file from my downloads to lib Inferno Template IGs. And I'll run it again. I'll just go back, hit validate again. It's still, the validator isn't up yet. Now it looks like it is. When you actually have to load IGs, the validator takes longer to start. All right, so there we go. Now it validated against patient, right? We can see these validation warnings are gone. So great, our resource has been validated. And it doesn't say that it validated it against this US Core patient, but if it does also validate against any profiles listed in meta.profile. Okay, so we have loaded an IG. We can use the validator. Now let's look at the actual test that we got with this template, right? It comes with some tests to sort of get you started. And so here's a test that's going to read a capability statement. Here's one that's going to perform a read interaction and read a patient, and then validate a patient resource. So I'll just run all of these tests. I'll need a URL for a server, and I happen to know one. I know a patient ID. We have a patient with an ID of 85 on this server. All right, so capability statement passed. And we can click on this little web icon to see the request that was made, where we made a GET request to that URL I put /metadata, which is how you get the capability statement. If we look at details, we can see the request headers, response headers. If there was a request body, it would be here. But here we can see the response body, right? So here's a capability statement. That's what that looks like. If we look in the patient tests, we tried to read the patient interaction. We expected a 200, but we got a 401. So that seems like an authorization error. We can look at this request. And right, so we got a 401. And here the response body, we got an operation outcome. And diagnostics bearer token is invalid or not supplied. So we didn't actually supply a bearer token, which we will need in order to access resources on this server, because that is how the server is configured. So we can go ahead and look at this code now. So I'm going to look at the actual, this is in the patient group. So here's the patient group, which is just in, might be easier to see this way, right? In lib Inferno Template patient group. And right here, we do a FHIR read. I don't see anything about the FHIR client. Let's go back to the main, the actual test suite. So here we have our test suite. It has a title, a description, right? We input that URL. And here's the FHIR client, right? All FHIR requests in the suite will use this FHIR client. So FHIR client, URL. So there's nothing defining a bearer token on here. So let's look at the documentation and see if we can figure out how to do that. If we go to writing tests, we are interested in making requests, and we are interested in making FHIR requests. So before making a FHIR request, a client needs to be created, and clients are passed down from a suite or group to all of their descendants, right? Which is why here we can see the client is defined in the test suite. It isn't then redefined in the patient group. And okay, so here, right, we have URL. Here's the bearer token ABC. So it looks like I can say bearer token and then put a string to use that bearer token. So I happen to know that this server has a hard-coded token we can use for testing. So I'll set the bearer token to sample token. And run it again. I'll just start from scratch, run the tests. Hey, this time it passed, right? We got a 200 back. And if we look in these details, right here, we actually received the patient resource that we expected. So that's great. But if we're really writing tests, we probably don't want to have a hard-coded bearer token, right? That seems pretty bad. That means we'll only be able to test against this one server. So let's see if we can use an input for that. So if we go back to the documentation, right, it says, yeah, we probably don't want to hard code the server URL or bearer token. So we can use a Ruby symbol, and then we'll read those values from an input. So for instance, here we have two inputs, one for server URL and one for an access token. And then we can use those symbols and we'll load those inputs. So we have input URL. Go ahead and add input access token, and then bearer token, access token. And you do have to restart it. This is not going to be automatically reloaded when you make a change. So you have to wait for it to come back up, and you can tell that it's ready to go again when you see this like listening on 004567. That's saying, hey, Inferno is up and ready for requests. All right, so now we should see an input for the token. There it is. So I can put in our URL, this be sample token, patient ID 85, and these should all still pass. This one test takes a little longer because here we're validating, and validating uses a separate service. And the first resource you validate, the validator will just be slower as it sort of warms up. If we run all these tests again, right, it goes a lot faster because the validator's already warmed up. All right, so we have successfully, right, added a bearer token to these tests so that we can test against servers which require authorization. And I'm getting kind of tired of typing these inputs all the time. So I am going to do something which is so new that we haven't actually documented it yet. So wish me luck. We have the beginnings of a command line utility for Inferno. So we can run Inferno, and I'll say help. So these are like some things that we can do with this command. Inferno console is very handy. We're not going to do that right now. And I just know that inside of suite, if I do Inferno suite help, there's this input template that we can use to create an input template. And to do that, we need to know the suite ID. I can use Inferno suites to list the available suite IDs. I mean, I could also see the ID right here. I need to migrate first. So here's an ID test suite template. And if I go, that's too much to go back up. So let's get the help again. So BE, Inferno suite input template. There's more help here. I think it'll do it if I do this. I have to say help. There we go. So there's an option, right, -F or -, file name to specify a file name for this preset template. So suite input template, and then test suite template is my ID, and I'll say make this file in reference server template.json. If I look at git status, like there's something config presets in config presets. There's now this reference server template.json. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up. That's in config presets reference server template. Here's a preset for the Inferno Test Suite template. That is not a great title. Let's say Inferno reference server. And then I want to set the URL to be used, which is that same one I've been typing over and over. The access token, sample token, because I know we have a hard-coded token. Patient ID can be 85. So now I'll save that. And now if I run Inferno again, I should see the option to just automatically load those inputs so I don't have to type them in every time. So now there's this preset menu up here. If I click on that, I can click Inferno reference server. It says it's been set as a preset. Now, if I try to run the tests, those inputs are already populated. So now I don't have to type them in every time. So you won't have to hear me type clack, 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 clack quite as much. All right. So we now have a preset so we can test things faster. So now I'll add a new group, a new test. If anyone has any requests for things that they would particularly like to see, I am open to doing what you'd like to see rather than what I have planned. So, raise your hand, put it in chat, shout out, whatever. I was thinking that we could add a test for US core condition. So I'll go ahead and do that. So the tests live in lib. And here is our main suite, right? There's lots of cleanup I could do in here, like changing the title and the description, but that's not very exciting for a demo. So I'm not going to show that off. So let's make a new group. I'm going to make a new group. And this is going to be a group that's going to do tests related to conditions. So here's this capability statement group. I gave it an ID of capability statement. Okay, I'll give this group an ID of condition. You don't actually have to give it an ID and like a random one will be generated, but it's a lot nicer if you have a meaningful ID, title, condition, and I'll just skip a description. I could do one, but it's fine if I don't. I don't think the UI will blow up or anything. So then if I want to add a test, I can say test do, just like up here, and a test gets a title and a description. So for patient, I had us input a patient ID, and then we just did a read. I don't know any condition IDs off the top of my head, so I don't want to just have to go look one up and do it. If I have a patient ID, I should be able to search for a condition like for that patient. So let's go and see what US Core says for conditions. Here's a US Core condition profile. And right here's the view about the resource itself. And then down below that, there's information about what searches you need to support for the condition resource. And here's a mandatory search parameter saying that a server shall support searching for conditions using the patient search parameter. So great. We have a patient ID, so I should just be able to use that to perform this search and get some condition resources. So let's see how we actually perform a FHIR search. So we can go back to the documentation. And right here, making requests, right? We want let's see, available FHIR request methods. Here are some methods that are currently available. Hey, FHIR search, that's one. But yeah, all the details for how to use these are in the other documentation. So I'll go and look at this other documentation. Let's look at FHIR search. So if I want to perform a search, I'll say FHIR search, and then I'll need to give the resource type. That can be a string, a symbol, or a class. So let's do FHIR search. Condition is the resource type. Client default, that's fine. And then params is the search params. So let's say params, and params is a hash, right? So you put it in curly braces. So if we look back at the implementation guide, we want, right, patient is the search parameter. So we'll say patient, and then we want that patient ID input, right? That was patient ID. And we should also say in here that we are using the input patient ID. And if we go look in the patient group, that's the same input there. So Inferno will recognize that these are the same input, and it won't prompt me to like input two patient IDs. It will just reuse this value in both places. So now I'm inputting a patient ID. I'm searching for a condition. And then let's do just a simple assertion to start with, right? Let's assert that we get a 200 back, right? Just like we did up here. And sure, we can assert a resource type too, right? If we do a FHIR search, we should get a bundle back. So we can assert resource type, say bundle, say bundle, or I could say FHIR bundle, whichever style you prefer. Since we did condition here, I'll just go with bundle, string. All right. And now let's see if I messed anything up or if this test actually works.
And then for the client that was set to default, if you change that, what exactly changes? Is that the client that's performing the search, or?
So I'll say in 90+% of cases, you won't have to worry about that because, well, I'm going to make an assumption that for most use cases, you're testing against a single FHIR server. But if you need to test against multiple FHIR servers, there's a bit in the documentation about this. Right, making requests to multiple servers. So,
got it.
Right, you can say FHIR client and say, oh, this is client A, and this one is client B. So those could be pointing at different servers, or could contain like separate credentials. And so then like when you perform a FHIR read, you can say which client you want to use in order to direct your request to a particular server.
That's great.
Yeah, so that is what that is, right? And if you don't actually put anything here, just like we didn't, right? We just said FHIR client do, then like this is the default client. I just made finger quotes, which you guys can't see because my camera isn't on. That's the default client. So that's why in here, like default is like the default value for client, right? So you don't have to specify which client to use if you just want to use one that's been defined like this. All right, I tried to run this and got an error. Let's see what this error is. Undefined local variable or method patient ID. Okay. Wow. that. I'll say that's puzzling to me. That says patient ID. Oh, yeah. All right. So part of your test that runs has to go inside a run block. Right. So this is what actually gets run when you run your test. So again, we should give this test like an ID. So this will be like condition search by patient title. Patient. Okay, so that time it loaded successfully. All right, fingers crossed. Let's see if this works. Right, as I said, we just see the patient ID in here once, right? Because it recognizes that they're the same. It's being slow because the validator's warming up. All right, so we performed a a search. We can look at this. All right, we got back a bundle. So we got back a bundle. That's great. We want that. But we probably also want to make sure that these conditions we got back conform to the condition profile. And you're welcome to do that in this same test. We on the Inferno team typically split up like the accessing the data from the validating the data. We think of those as sort of like two separate steps. So I'll do a separate test for that, but again, you're welcome to do that in the same test. So I'll say, so this will be like condition bundle validation. So now we are in the case where here we have a test where we want to access what was returned by this previous test, or this request, right? This request got the bundle back. Here we want to validate the bundle. So how can we get access to the request from this test within this test? So if we go into the documentation for making requests, we're using requests. So we can, right, we could just repeat the request, but if you're doing a lot of requests in your test suite, and if those requests aren't very fast, then that's going to make things really slow. So we can just load up the request that was made by that previous test. So in order to do this, we give a request a name, specify that a test makes a named request, and then specify that another test uses that named request. So here in this example, all right, declare that this test makes a particular request. So we say makes request, and then we give it some identifier. So I'll say makes request, let's say condition patient search. And then here in the request, we say, oh, this is the request with that name. So when we perform this request, it will get like saved with that name. So name patient search. And then in the following test, we want to declare that this test uses that request. So we say uses request, and then we give that identifier. Uses request patient search. And like when you perform like a FHIR, so if you perform like an HTTP request or a FHIR request, you can, if you just say like request, that'll get you the request. You can say response and you'll have access to the response. If it's a FHIR request, you can also say resource, and that is the resource that was returned. So just to like demonstrate that this works, also like info resource. So this is going to make an info message with that resource as like the contents of the message. I guess I should make it resource.to JSON so that we get like the string representation of the resource rather than like the actual Ruby object, which would not look right. So that's ready. Load up the preset, run the tests. All right, so we have a message now, so I can click this message. All right, here's, right, type is info way down here, right, and here's that bundle that was returned. And we can also see here in requests, you know, this test didn't make the request, but it still shows up here since we said it uses it. There's this little like icon here saying that this request was performed in another test and the results being used by this test. So you can still see that request here, so you don't have to go searching around to try and figure out where that request was made in order to see like what is actually in the request. Okay, but we wanted to validate, right? So I've shown that we're actually getting that resource here. So now how do we actually validate it? So we're going to want to perform some assertions, and let's look at the documentation and see what it says. Hey, assertions and results. So use assertions to check. I'll summarize this and say that, you know, you say assert, and then you put some condition. If that thing is true, the assertion passes. If that assertion is false, it fails and the test will fail. So this documentation doesn't describe every possible assertion that you can make. So we can, again, go to the more detailed API documentation to see that. So assert, this is just like the bare basic version. And, you know, you can use that to make more complicated assertions, right? So like all these more complicated ones, like assert response status, which we've used, and assert resource type, which we also used, right? These, you know, at the end of the day are themselves calling assert. So we can do assert valid resource to assert that a resource is valid. And there's also this special one, assert valid bundle entries. We can use that to go through a bundle and make assertions on the individual entries within that bundle. So let's look at assert valid bundle entries. So here's an example that will only validate patient bundle entries, right? If we say the resource types is patient, and is someone talking? Oh, okay. And we could, you know, validate patient and condition resources. Or, oh, there's a great typo. In this case, right, we're expecting to get US core condition resources back. So we want to validate that. We don't just want to validate the conditions. We want to validate that they are valid US core conditions. So if in resource types, we make that hash, we give a resource type and then a profile URL. Then we will validate that those resource types are valid against that profile URL. And this does, this lets you filter out to only validate particular types of resources in the bundle, because like any search result you could get, for example, operation outcomes back, and you wouldn't want to be trying to validate operation outcomes against, say, the condition profile. All right, so we want to do something like this. Assert valid bundle entries. And then what's that look like? Resource types. And I'll want condition. Then I'll want the condition profile URL. So I can go back to US Core. We are looking at condition, and there is the official profile URL. So now if I run, that should perform validation. And that one went slower. That's a good sign that it's actually doing something. So condition bundle is valid. So here we can see we got some messages, right? We got a bunch of all okays, so a bunch of resources that are totally okay, and one warning. But a warning isn't an error, so it passed. So one of them didn't have a category. Well, so there we go. We started out with the template, and then we added an access token so that we could access resources on a server which requires authorization. And then we added a preset so that we didn't have to type in our inputs over and over. And then we added tests to perform a search for conditions and validated that those test for validating that those conditions are valid US core conditions. So yeah, that's sort of like the basics of how you can write tests with Inferno. And I was going to open it up for